UFC Fight Night Derrick Lewis vs Sergey Spivak takes place in just a few hours, and it's not the best card, but I'm looking forward to it just for the road to UFC finals fights. Obviously, it was meant to be UFC Korea, Giga Chikadze vs Korean Zombie, but I believe it was Zombie who pulled out of that fight, but they kept it in the same time slot, unfortunately, but I understand why, because lots of Asian fighters on there. And even though the card's not the best, I'm still going to be breaking it down from top to bottom, so let's get into it. Now, going forward in my predictions, I've started writing down notes on the fighters and why I think they're going to win. So if you see me looking down, that's obviously just me looking at my notes. But we start off with Tatsu Taira versus Jesus Aguilera. And Jesus is good. He's an 8-1 fighter making his UFC debut, and his only loss was his pro debut. But what stands out to me about Tatsu Taira is he's undefeated pro and amateur. He's a big flyweight, 5'7" and 70-inch reach. And Jesus is only 5'4" with a 62.5-inch reach. And in the flyweight division, that makes a lot of a difference. Now, Jesus does finish the majority of his fights, and a lot of them are by chokes, but Taira doesn't give up his back a lot, and this isn't his UFC debut. He's used to fighting in the UFC, and, you know, Jesus, this is his UFC debut. Taira doesn't give up his back a lot, as I said, which is where Jesus finds most of his finishes, and Taira is a good striker as well, so that's why I'm picking Tatsu Taira by decision. Next up, we have Young Park versus Dennis Tululan, and I'm taking Young Park here. Now, don't be fooled by Tululan's record. It is good. You know, it looks deceiving, but he's only lost to undefeated prospects or people who are 1-0. But then I look at Young Park's record, and I just think he has the tools necessary to get the victory. His only loss is a fight to Gregory Rodriguez, you know, Robocop, that mad guy who, you know, he was winning that fight until he got caught with a counter punch, and Rodriguez is a good fighter. I know he lost his last fight, but that was a scrap back and forth, and I don't think many people expected him to lose that. But, you know, he ultimately lost that fight because he was getting aggressive and got hit with a counter punch, and he beat Joseph Holmes quite convincingly, and Joseph Holmes ain't no mug. And he got the sub, so I think here, you know, Young Park is going to get the third round sub. Next up, we have Yi Young Kim taking on Mandy Baum, and not a lot to say about this one. I want to believe in Mandy Baum. I believe she could get it done. But she was a great prospect coming to UFC 7-0, and now she's lost both of her fights. One to Ariane Lipski and one to Victoria Leonardo. Whereas Yi Young Kim has lost a split decision to Jocelyn Edwards. And she was arguably robbed against Molly McCann because Molly McCann was having a Hulk Hogan moment in the final round. And, you know, Yi Young Kim has the worst record on paper, but Mandy Baum hasn't impressed me in the UFC, and Yi Young Kim only loses close fights to okay competition for the women's division. So I'm going to have to take Yi Young Kim by decision on this one, but I do think this is Mandy Baum's last chance to get her career back on track. I am going to be referring to my notes quite a lot because it's the beginning of the road to the UFC finals, and I haven't really watched Road to UFC finals. I've got no clue about it, so I'm just using outside sources, what I've heard and what I kind of know. And also I need to refer to the notes to pronounce these names. So here we go. Fight number one out of the Road to UFC final fights is Hung Sung Park versus Song Guk Choi. And from what I heard, I'm picking Park over Choi because he's another big flyweight of 5'7" with a 66-inch reach. And he's undefeated, finishing all of his fights bar one. And Choi, even though he's also a big flyweight, he doesn't have that finishing threat. And there was a big difference apparently to how they made their opponents look. So I'm going to take Park by decision. Then we have Rina Nakamura versus Tojomomi Kazama. And I'm taking Nakamura in this one. He's undefeated. He finishes most of his fights in the first round with his power. And he's got dominant wrestling. And Kazama also has good finishing ability from what I've seen. But he went to a decision in the road to the UFC fight. And his opponent pulled out, so he got to buy into the final. So even though he's a good jiu-jitsu artist from what I've heard, and he could get a finish off of his back, with Nakamura's striking factor, I just think he's going to be too much, and he's going to get a round 2 TKO. Then we have Jia, I think that's how you say it, Jia versus Young Lee. Now, Jia has an impressive record, but if you take a deep dive into it, a lot of it isn't against high-level competition. He is very active, but a lot of his opponents' records are very naff. You know, you get that a lot in the regional scene. and a lot of his opponents' records are negative. And one of his fights ended in a split decision on the road to the UFC. And then you look at Yu Young Lee, who's a big featherweight, 5'10", like not a Max Holloway featherweight either, from what I've heard from MMA Guru, my main source when it comes to these predictions. I'm not sure on. He's a bulky, and his opponents have all been decent level competition. He's managed to take him out pretty easily. So, he ended both of his road to UFC fights in under a minute. I know that, and I think he's going to knock out Jia Yi in the first round. And then the final fight from the road to UFC finals is Anshul Jubilee versus Yeka Saragi. I don't even know. We're going to call him Yeka, and we're going to call him Jubilee. Now, Jubilee has only had one fight to get to this position, kind of like the other guy, and end the split decision. And he doesn't have a great finishing ability. Now, he is on a 6-0 record, but half of his opponents' records looked a bit, suspect. And Yeka has had 2 fights on the road to UFC, finished them both as a pretty sizable underdog. He's fought decent level competition for his whole career. And even though it's great to see Jubilee in the UFC, because it's not often you see an Indian fighter in the UFC and they're trying to break into that market, I just think Yeka hits hard, he hits fast, and he's going to upset the odds and get a finish in the first round. So those are my road to UFC picks. I don't know much about the road to UFC. Hopefully they add up with yours, and hopefully I'm right, because obviously my pay-per-view curse showed last time my predictions record isn't looking too good, so I could do well on this card. But let's get back into some fights that I, have been able to predict just off my knowledge. Next up, we have Yusaka Kinoshita versus Adam Fujita, and I'm taking Kinoshita on this one. He's coming from the Contender Series, and even though his opponent's been a bit of a mixed bag, so have Adam Fujita. Adam Fujita, granted, his UFC debut was against Moraes, and Moraes is tough, 13-0 or 14-0 now, and he showed great toughness in that fight. But I just think Kinoshita, he should be 7-0. His only loss come from grabbing the fence, and even though his opponent's been a bit of a mixed bag like Fujita's, I just think he's going to be the one that finds the shots when it really comes down to it. I'm expecting a good, scrappy back and forth match. Fujita is good, but Kinoshita has finished all of his fights as well with a mix of submissions and punches, and I just think when it comes down to it in the third round, both men are tied. He's going to be the one that finds the kill shot. So Kinoshita by a close decision. Next up, we have the returning Du Hoi Choi taking on Cal Nelson, and Cal Nelson's a really underrated fighter. You look at his record, you think he's lost to some big names, but it's like your Bruno Ferreira's and your Billy Quarantillo, so they're great fighters. And Du Hoi Choi, he's lost to some good fighters in his own right. He won the Ultimate Fighter, he lost to Cub Swanson, and I can't remember the other 2 people he lost to off the top of my head, but they were big names, and he hasn't won since 2016, hasn't fought since 2019. And I do believe that's because he had to do his mandatory military service, just like the Korean Zombie did a few years ago. And if he didn't have to do that, he wasn't active. If this was if he was active, if this fight was just surface value, Cal Nelson versus Du Hoi Choi, I'd probably take Du Hoi Choi. But because of the inactivity, and Cal Nelson's the underdog here, only a slight underdog, but he is the underdog, and a lot of people underestimate him, I'm going with Cal Nelson picking up a decision win over Du Hoi Choi here. Next up, we move on to our featured fight, which is Marcin Tybura versus Blagany Ivanov. And Ivanov? I've seen him fight a few times, but I can't really pronounce his name still. But listen, I think Marcin Tybura is a great fighter. And, I'm going to have to go with him. Ivanov, he was a decent fighter, but he's dropped off a bit for me, and Tybura always seems to be the one controlling the pace in heavyweight. He seems to survive a lot of heavy hitters, and I know Ivanov survived Derrick Lewis, but Tybura just always seems to control the pace, and I feel like I feel like one round will go to Ivanov, one round will go to Tybura, and then it'll come down to the third round. Tybura will be that one pushing that pace and getting that victory. I mean, it's heavyweight, it's unpredictable. Both men are evenly matched, so it could go either way. I just think with Tybura pushing that pace, he is going to get a decision. And as Tom Aspinall said, both men are great fighters, and it could go either way. But I'd love to fight Marcin Tybura. I think he's a great fighter. Next up, we come to the co-main event, which is Daun Jung versus Devin Clark. And Daun Jung is my lock of the card. Because you look at Devin Clark, a lot of his losses have come by finish. He got finished by Jon Cutelaba, and Jon Cutelaba's UFC career is just a bit of a joke, really, in it. And Daun Jung has finished a lot of his opponents. I know he got caught by Dustin Jacoby, but, you know, he got caught. And he was winning that fight. He trains with a good team, a Korean top team, and he's a great prospect. And a lot of people will look at that draw to Sam Alvey and think, well, why are you saying that? He's had a draw to Sam Alvey. Ryan Spann had a split decision to Sam Alvey. Look at what Ryan Spann's going on to do. He's fighting Nikita Krylov. And if he beats Nikita Krylov, he could very well go on to fight for the title soon. You know, it's kind of a title eliminator because in the light heavyweight division, we don't know what's quite going on at the top of the division, especially with Glover's retirement. So, Daun Jung, I have to take him my first round knockout. Great prospect, training with a great team, finishes a lot of his opponents, and Devin Clark gets finished a lot. So, first round knockout, he's my lock of the card. And next up, our main event, Derrick Lewis versus Sergey Spivak, who's a great fighter. And it's always hard to bet on a Derrick Lewis fight. You never know which way it's going to go. But I am picking Derrick Lewis. This is the last time I will pick Derrick Lewis. If he loses, I will not pick Derrick Lewis. But not only has Derrick Lewis got in phenomenal shape, you know, if you haven't seen it, go look it up. He's in great shape. It's also, I think Derrick knows this is one of his last opportunities, so he's starting to take it seriously. That's probably why he got in shape. And against wrestlers, or wrestle-heavy opponents, he always seems to do well, you know? Like, to beat Derrick Lewis, you have to strike with him, and Sergey Spivak will not be able to strike with Derrick Lewis. I tell you that now. Because he's not really a great striker, and Derrick Lewis has got that one-hit power. I mean, Derrick Lewis's chin has kind of deteriorated, but who did he get knocked out by? Blachowicz and Tuivasa, and they're both heavy hitters. You know, Tuivasa put Cyril Gane down. Ngannou couldn't do that. And Blachowicz is putting out men in under a minute. So, you know, and Sergey Spivak will have a hard time taking Derrick Lewis down, I think. And when he does, I think Derrick Lewis will be straight back up like he normally is. So, all the signs to me are pointing to Derrick Lewis on this one. Part of me thinks maybe I've said all this, Blachowicz will get an upset. But I think Derrick Lewis is actually the underdog. So, he's a very good underdog to bet on. And, you know, I just think Derrick Lewis knows his last opportunity. And I'm going Derrick Lewis first round KO. There, I said it. Similar to a Curtis Blades knockout, I think. Maybe Sergey goes for the takedown, uppercut down the middle. Who knows? Derrick Lewis by first round KO, though. Guys, that was my predictions for UFC Fight Night. Derrick Lewis vs Sergey Spivak. Sorry about the lack of uploads this week. I did have some good stuff planned, but unfortunately I was a bit ill. And then I had a job interview. So, I'll be making loads of content next week, definitely. Obviously, it's a pay-per-view week, so I make plenty of content for that week anyway. And probably the week after, when it's Erin Blanchfield versus Santos, I'll get the content out that I was going to get this week out then, because there won't be a lot to talk about. But, yeah, it's an okay card tonight. Not the strongest, but I'm looking forward to it just for the road to UFC fights and Derrick Lewis. We've got Laura Sanko making his debut on commentary as well. Well, she does Contender Series, but her Fight Night / pay-per-view debut. Hopefully she's replacing Bisping. I think she is. I can't stand to listen to Bisping commentate. But hey ho, he'll probably be on the UFC 286 card, won't he? But there we are. If you have liked the video, don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe. Protect yourself at all times, and I'll see you in the next one.